So I selected this title of Higher Education in an Age of the Unthinkable, and it is hard for me to imagine, if I think back 2.5 years ago, just as I was about to begin my service at the American Council on Education, that we would find ourselves in this short period of time with things that were then unthinkable. An African-American president in the United States, a Tory Liberal Democrat coalition government in the UK, a financial crisis that brought giants like Lehman Brothers and General Motors to their knees and nearly led to a worldwide economic meltdown. And at least for a while, Americans were interested in paying attention to the World Cup. So I'm going to talk about 5 groundbreaking trends that I see in the United States. I think many of them you share now or will in the near term. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground in the 35 to 40 minutes that has been allocated, but I want you to know that I'm going to be here through tomorrow morning and will be happy to stay through. I think you have about a half an hour break. If any of you want to give me feedback or ask questions or discuss any of these issues, I would be happy to do so. So we feel the ground is shifting on us in American higher education, and my guess is you do too. The first point I want to raise is, excuse me, on the heightened international economic competition that for the most part is in front of us, and we are competing in a new environment with much larger numbers of college-educated workers and the need to simultaneously preserve and expand centers of excellence in graduate education and in research. No small feat for us to accomplish all of those goals in a period of recession. Second, relating to the economic crisis and the losses in both institutional endowment for most private and some public institutions, the decline in state support for general operating purposes, and we see a new urgency in the discussions about the relationship between public higher education and the states, and most signs suggest that we will have less money to spend, but that lower dollar amount does not in any way diminish policymakers' interest in exercising increasing control over higher education. That may be the new normal. The third trend, due to the economic crisis, a lot of attention is now being paid to thinking or rethinking the business model of higher education. This may be a typical strategy for America, where business models and the market economy are wired in our DNA, and we are looking for improvements in efficiency and productivity, both on the management organizational side and on, shall we say, the intellectual productivity or the learning side. So that is the rethinking of the business model. The fourth one, ascendance of the private sector and the provision of higher education, something that has occurred in a stunning way in a very short period of time. For-profit higher education. The increased demand for our workforce in the face of the economic crisis, constrained enrollment capacity at most public institutions, a very lax regulatory environment, all have led to explosive growth among for-profit providers. I think our experience in this regard may be a forerunner or perhaps some lessons learned for those of you in the UK as you begin to think and experience more for-profit higher education. And finally, each of these factors places additional pressure on our system of quality assurance for students, and policymakers are demanding heightened productivity, consumer protection, and increased evidence of improved student learning. So let's get started. And I want to turn to the new economic landscape, if I can get this to work. Richard?
Just click on the mouse on the screen.
That's what I tried. That's going backwards. And now move this one. Great. This is a pretty simple graphic, but I think it has a profound message behind it. It's a major trend, and I think in many ways overarches all of the others in the new global economic landscape. Due in large part to the ascent of China and of India, economists are projecting that Asia will become the center of gravity in the world economy before the middle of this century, and will be producing more than half of all the world's income. You note from this graphic that the share of the world's wealth by Africa, produced by Africa and Latin America, will also rise, with the resulting decline in the shares coming from Europe and from North America. A simple graphic, a profound message. We should welcome this progress because the world will become safer and happier and more prosperous and place other nations in a more positive developmental circumstance. And of course, as their capacity grows, it opens up new markets for goods and services. But nonetheless, this new global landscape does place increased pressure on higher education because human resources are the critical ingredient in this kind of economic development for all nations. Both China and India have enormous populations. Their combined population of the younger generation, those who will be coming through the education pipeline, is 10 times that of the US. So in terms of scale, we are talking about huge differences looking to the future. According to the Ministry of Education in China, now 20% of the age cohort are attending higher education of some sort in China, having increased from 3% in 1990 to 20% today, and with a total of some 27 million students studying higher education in China. 27 million compared to our today 18 million, and we can see that that gap will continue to expand. India is educating less than 10% of its population, but if you look at the profile of their population, their young population is going to be much greater than that of China in the decades ahead. So India, while behind, is moving rapidly. 12 million students now enrolled in higher education in India, and the minister said in a meeting I had with him a couple of months ago, they are planning to get to 75 million students enrolled in higher education in India in the decades ahead and before the middle of the century. I mean, these are critically important because it will be these educated individuals in the workforce that will be the engine of their economies. So in Europe and in the US, we are not going to be able to compete by scale alone in ways that, frankly, the US has grown accustomed to. And I think some of us tend to think of it as if it were a natural right that we would always be in this place, and we can smell the coffee and are getting the wake-up call. So we are going to have to compete not by size in the way we have in the past, but by the quality of the educational offerings that we have, the quality of our workforce, and our capacity to innovate. So let me see how we look, UK and US, in comparison to the leading countries around the world. Although China and India may represent the most important long-term challenge for us in higher education, we are already behind a number of these nations. Canada, Japan, Korea, each educate a much larger share of their young population than we do. In the last report by OECD, U.S. ranked 10th. I saw one yesterday, a new one that has come out, and the U.S. is ranked 8th in the world in the level of educational attainment of that 25 to 34-year-old cohort, the one in red in each of these histograms. UK is in 14th. So we share the profile of having been the world's leaders and now finding ourselves falling behind. Now, these simple rankings don't tell the whole story for sure, and we certainly think that the diversity of the student enrollment in U.S. higher education presents much different complexities than the far less diverse countries like Korea and Japan. But it is hard for us to ignore the fact that we have fallen behind. Because, in fact, in the U.S., we have stagnated. And for the first time ever, the youngest population has a lower level of educational attainment than the next oldest cohort in our country. And of course, the American dream is that every generation will be better off than the previous one, and that has been linked directly with the level of education. This metric has taken on much greater significance since the election of Barack Obama as president, and he has been joined by a number of the large foundation philanthropic communities to lay out an absolutely audacious goal of regaining world leadership in the level of educational attainment by 2020. At the same time that we in the U.S. are being challenged and under pressure to expand access and to produce more graduates, we are also being challenged to defend our global position as a leader in higher education, in our capacity, thank you, Richard, to attract international students and faculty. So in addition to maintaining that leadership role, maintaining a preeminence in research, and expanding our global presence or our global footprint. So all of these are important objectives in a time of economic downturn. And so not surprisingly, we are seeing an increase in competition within and among the segments that comprise American higher education. This is what I think of as a leapfrogging moment in higher education, where those who are farther down the pecking order in the ranking of institutions have, in the face of recession, these challenges and yet these opportunities to leapfrog into a stronger position as we shift from a mostly domestic focus to a much more global focus. Public research universities in particular are under significant pressure. Throughout the 90s and the early part of this century, they have watched as the great private research universities have been able to recruit their faculty from the public institutions with much higher salaries and startup grants for their research and for their labs. I can tell you firsthand, because in Chapel Hill, you don't even have to call the moving van to go to a private institution called Duke, a few miles away. And so the issue of shifting grounds and competition within higher education has been a fact of life, but it is now increasing and increasing palpably. Public institutions have a harder time with their global profile than do private institutions, because the state feels a kind of ownership and doesn't want to share that ownership beyond the borders of the state. So as a result, private institutions like New York University, which comes to my mind as a great example of an institution that is leapfrogging those rankings as it shifts its focus from domestic university rankings into global research networked universities. You probably know or have read about Simon Marginson from Australia, who I think has done some of the great research on globalization. And he writes about this tension between mass teaching and elite research and the roles of the university in a national perspective versus a global perspective. And I can tell you in Chapel Hill, we would not typically in front of our legislators brag about the global dimensions of the University of North Carolina. It simply wouldn't sell in a legislature that believes that it owns this university and that its major priority is to serve the people of the state. So during the good times, universities are challenged to navigate all of these tensions, but in tough economic times, it is even more difficult. Here's what the fiscal crisis looks like in the states in the U.S. The last recession from 2002 to 2005, and now the current one with the estimates for the current year and for next year. Big differences. And I should begin by acknowledging that I have a deep appreciation for the kinds of cuts that you have experienced and are fearful of in the near future in UK, and that your cuts may indeed have been tougher on you than the ones in the US, because as I'm going to talk about in a minute, some of the cutbacks and budget problems at the state level have been compensated for by the infusion of federal money, particularly through the stimulus package. So, just to remind you, in the U.S., regular operating support for public institutions comes from the state. The states don't have the authority or power to deficit spend. So when budget cuts come as a result of declining tax revenues, higher education suffers the most because it is the largest discretionary part of most state budgets. So in 43 states, we have seen this kind of significant reduction. The rates vary, of course, from one state to another, with the largest cuts coming in Massachusetts at 37%. Now, some of this is compensated for by increases in tuition. I know you'd be shocked to hear that there are some legislators who cut operating support, look the other way when tuition is increased, and then observe the tuition and find criticism for raising tuition and making it more difficult for students and families. I'm sure this kind of perspective does not occur in the UK, but I have seen it. So because it takes the states much longer to recover from a downturn than the federal government or from the private sector, it really isn't clear what this new normal is going to look like when the dust settles. So let me turn now to the stimulus package. And you can see with these little red toppings here how much the federal stimulus package helped us avoid the major cuts that were on the horizon for us. Like most of you, I have spent my professional career building the strongest arguments I could advance, advocating for them to government officials in the most effective way I could imagine, and really being happy if I got half a loaf. The work we did, this was my very first project after I became president of the American Council on Education. Our very first project was working through the back channels of the recently elected president before he came into office in formulating the stimulus package. And for the first time in my life, we got more than we asked for. It was a stunning statement, both about our lowered expectations based on history of where the federal government was going to place its priorities, and on the extent to which this new administration really gets it that to maintain a prosperous economy is going to require an ever more well-educated workforce. It was stunning. About $140 billion went directly into education. I calculate that for higher education, when you add increases in funding that went to students in the form of need-based financial aid, other special targeted programs, and tax credits for families to offset tuition, that we got into American higher education more than $160 billion in this stimulus package. It was a stunning investment in research and in teaching. And the end of this month is the final chapter in the stimulus package. What hasn't been committed by the 30th of September, which is the change of fiscal year for us, will go back into the federal treasury. So it has been enormously important to us. It probably helped reduce state budgets by 30 to 40% during 2009 and 2010, and probably maybe as much as 10% in the coming year. So let me say a little bit more about the relationship between the states and the public institutions. In many cases, state higher education systems have negotiated much greater freedom, much more autonomy from things like procurement or contracting and other regulatory dimensions of the state. In a few cases, institutions have agreed to accept a lower budget amount in exchange for quasi-private status. I was saying at our dinner table last evening that I've been working with the dean of the business school at UCLA, and yesterday it was announced that she is taking UCLA's business school private. And they have negotiated. It will keep the UCLA name, the funding going to UCLA from the state of California will then support all the rest of the programs, and the business school will be freed up to set its own tuition, to raise its own money, and to get out from under the entire regulatory apparatus of the state of California, which is massive, I might say, having spent a number of years in California. Now, we have to understand that these privatization schemes won't help everybody, that they favor the most selective institutions and the ones that have independent sources of revenue. For most institutions, the power to set tuition really doesn't eliminate the practical and political limits of what can be charged. There's lots of discussion in the U.S. about the impact of escalating tuition on access and on families. And we all know that tuition dollars can't always replace public funding, especially over the long haul. But even when the public cuts funding, they do not cut expectations and oversight and accountability. And we are seeing a continued escalation in pressure to demonstrate value for the dollar, and it is resulting in lots of new efforts in higher education in the U.S. to pursue productivity improvements, both in organization and in learning outcomes. I'm turning now to the issue around the workforce demands, and this is a comparison between 1973 and 2010, a long sweep of time. But I've noted already that President Obama has been very public about his ambition to regain first-in-the-world status in educational attainment. And unfortunately, our current projections suggest that we may actually be producing fewer degree holders than our economy will require. In a period of high unemployment, college-educated workers are doing much better than those that have only a high school diploma. 5% of unemployment for those that have only a high school, it means 5% for those who have a bachelor's degree, 10% for those who have only a high school diploma. We are facing a shortfall in college-educated workforce that is a combination of our attainment patterns, but the retirement of a very well-educated baby boom generation. At the same time, when you look at our economy, since 1950, about 20% of the workforce has been in low-skilled jobs. That percentage hasn't changed, about 20% in low-skilled jobs. In the meantime, jobs have more than doubled that require a college education. So moving up that educational attainment curve has had powerful impacts on the strength of our economy and on lifetime earnings of those who have earned advanced degrees. Tony Carnevale and his center at Georgetown, focusing on labor economics, have just produced some new reports that conclude that U.S. is going to need 22 million new college-educated workers between now and 2018, and we don't have a chance of succeeding in achieving that goal, and that we probably will be 3 to 5 million short of having enough well-qualified workers to fit the jobs for which U.S. can be competitive. And the National Governors Association have just launched a major new initiative called Complete to Compete, in which they are placing increasing pressure on college retention and completion, because our track record on retention and completion is not very positive. So lots of effort on institutions with funding at the state level tied to it, all linked to efforts to improve persistence and completion. So in the U.S., as I know it is here in the UK, the message is very much we must do more with less. And decreased funding in no way will lead to less government scrutiny or fewer government mandates. So we are turning to, and this is the third of my 5 themes, the new business models. Since raising tuition will not get us out of this financial bind, and pressure to increase the number of college educated workers is only going to increase. American colleges and universities, as well as a host of foundations. And in America, these foundations are banding together, applying not only their resources, but their pressure and their influence on higher education and also on the White House. It's a very interesting phenomenon that has unfolded over the last 12 months. So the think tanks, are all rethinking what the business model for higher education would look like and how we can achieve new efficiencies and new models of education, all for the purpose of maximizing the use of public funds, leveraging the philanthropic dollars coming from the foundations, and increasing the number of graduates. So, as is probably typical of America, where the competitive economy is wired in our DNA, we are looking hard at new business models, with the initial focus, of course, being on the business side. And so increasingly you are seeing us engaging in what is probably low-hanging fruit, outsourcing the development of consortia to leverage scale in matters of procurement and other kinds of management improvements. The University of North Carolina, along with UC Berkeley and Cornell, have all recently retained the Bain & Company consulting firm to come in and help us lay out strategies for saving millions and millions of dollars on the efficiency side, on the business side of our institutions. And while we clearly can find more administrative efficiencies, we all know that this is still probably only tinkering around the edge. And it really is the core academy where increased productivity must be found. Question is, can we find ways to teach students more efficiently without sacrificing learning, and maybe even improving that learning? So we're turning to some interesting curricular reforms. Time doesn't permit me to work my way through each of these, and this is just an exemplary list of the sorts of things that are going on in the intellectual productivity arena. But let me describe three quickly that I think are pretty interesting examples, and they all link to information technology, sophisticated algorithms, artificial intelligence. And I'm sure that some of these are very similar to the sorts of things that you are doing in the UK. Carnegie Mellon, it's online learning, and you could find a lot about that by Googling their online learning initiative. It was started by the IT folks, and the clear understanding for their support from the campus was, now this stuff on online learning didn't really apply to Carnegie Mellon students. It was only for those, shall we say, unwashed in those lesser institutions. And so they developed these courses. They're now getting a lot of money from foundations and some from our Secretary of Education, focusing on the transition courses in English and math between high school and college. But one day, and let me just describe what it involves. There are activities and problems that are part of their homework. And artificial intelligence is embedded in the software so that when students make mistakes in solving these problems, the hint balloon comes up and helps them drill down until they find something they really do understand and then build it back up to create an understanding of the problem. And one day, a very distinguished professor of logic at Carnegie Mellon came in and said, I want to put my course online. And they were thrilled because this was the first indication that maybe Carnegie Mellon students would be the beneficiaries of their work. So they said, sure, they'd be happy to help him. And he came back with a pile of dense text about this high, gave it to them and said, this is my course, put it online. And they did as they have done for the other courses, parsed it, interspersing activities, problem solving, and so forth. And he came back a month or so later to see how they were doing. And they demonstrated what they were doing, and he blew a gasket and said, no, 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 no. I gave you my course. That's what I want online. And this is the line I love most. I do not want my students interrupted while they're learning. And so this was an interesting negotiation, and ultimately they reached the conclusion that they'd offer both. And so they put his dense text online, and they put their program at where the students met face-to-face with the faculty member half the time as the ones using the dense text. And after a month or so, he came in and said, okay, I surrender, because the students in my course spend the entire class time asking me questions because they don't understand what I wrote. And the students in the artificial intelligence enhanced program, they come and see me less, but when they're in class, they're looking at extensions of the application of the principles that I have been describing. And so the online learning folks said, oh no, we're not going to quit now. We're going to see this through to the end, and we'll see what happens in the final exams. And I don't need to tell you what the outcome of that is. The students in that met half the time and used this enhanced programming just blew away the students who came in traditional class functioning, and instead of reading their material from a book, read it online. Another example that I want to talk about, I think, is a pretty interesting one, and it's one that one of the large for-profit companies is doing. And I don't know if you've ever heard of something called Eharmony.com, but it's a dating matching service. And it's based upon psychological research done by faculty members in the University of California. And it apparently is very, very successful in matching men and women who have the potential for long-term successful relationships, marriages, and so forth. They've taken the analytics and the data mining and the psychological research techniques of Eharmony and applied them to students and faculty members to find out about learning preferences and learning behaviors. And they're using that to form course sections and matching student groups with a faculty member with a goal of maximizing the learning outcome. Now, whoever would have guessed? It's going to be very interesting to see what comes of this large-scale experiment. And then the third one I want to mention is a series of analytics that essentially draw upon data mining techniques that look at everything that is known about a student over their educational cycle. And using these data and identifying trends with a goal of intercepting students who are at risk of either dropping out or of failing, and bringing tutoring and counseling and other support services to students before they reach that critical point of inflection. And then there's another one. A colleague from Chapel Hill has a company called metametrics. And he has developed a framework that was intended to allow you to crosswalk from various tests to get from the PSAT to the TOEFL to the ACT, all the various testing mechanisms that have different frameworks and different scaling. And it was intended to allow a crosswalking. And fundamentally, the statistical techniques define something that he calls lexiles for reading proficiency and something called quantiles for mathematic and analytic proficiencies. And by now, virtually all of the textbooks have been scored for the lexile level and the quantile level in order to effectively absorb what is in this book. And so, pick an example. You're teaching photosynthesis in a 10th grade biology class, and some of the students in the class have an 800 level lexile quantile, and others have a 1300. You can now sort and find out information on photosynthesis that is aimed at each of those levels and make it available as supplemental material to help students in a class that have very different levels of proficiency. Again, permitting us to think about customized, scalable strategies for improving learning. Promising activities still in the very earliest stages of consideration. The fourth of these trends is this ascendance of for-profit institutions in higher education. Take a look at this graphic. 61% increase in enrollment in for-profit institutions in 4 years. Stunning growth. And the circumstances are such that that kind of growth and profitability, I must say, have been present in our environment. They have grown very rapidly in comparison to both public and private nonprofit institutions. The demand for job training in a weak economy, the massive marketing and effective marketing campaigns that they target relatively unsophisticated consumers, the easy access to federal student aid and student loans, and a regulatory system that frankly can't keep up with the rapidly changing marketplace. So based on these factors, there are many observers who have drawn analogies, even before testimony in our Congress, that this is comparable to the subprime lending bubble, in that it has all kinds of potential profitability and growth. It has been astounding, absolutely astounding, and not surprisingly, we're now seeing a quick and very strong backlash. Government inquiries have uncovered brazen acts of fraud in student recruitment and in financial aid. On our Senate Education Committee hearing, you can find all this on their website. The General Accountability Office of our federal government sent out some secret shoppers to some of these for-profit institutions and videotaped their interchange with admissions offices, and it reveals a brazen misrepresentation. So the Congress is asking hard questions. Our Department of Education, in the midst of issuing some new regulations, it's an area that we need to keep our eye on, and I must say that the American Council on Education has taken this one on, and we're going to be jumping in the deep end to try to sort out how to preserve in this environment something that is precious to us, which is our voluntary, peer-reviewed assessment of quality. that has enabled a rich diversity of institutions in the U.S., which is a major part of the strength and quality of higher education. And it is going to be very much at risk because of issues that I would call more consumer protection problems, and that ought to be the domain of government. But the domain of academic quality must remain within the higher education community and through a peer assessment. So let me wrap up with the pressures on quality assurance. I've already mentioned the issues around accountability and the drive for productivity and efficiency, both on the administrative side and on the learning outcomes side, along with the goal of producing many more graduates with a lot less money and much higher quality. Piece of cake, right? Pressure to provide basic consumer protection, prompted by the fraud that has been uncovered in the for-profit community, raising questions about the viability of our entire quality assurance apparatus. And so institutions are now required by their accreditors to define and assess learning outcomes. But frankly, most of them do a lot of work in the preparation for the accreditation visit by gathering data on learning outcomes, but there's very little evidence yet that that data is then used to improve the learning experience of students. This is where we must be investing a lot more time. And it is at risk as a result of the for-profit fraud, because a private equity firm can create a company and go in and buy a small, private, nonprofit campus that is accredited and gain immediate, that accreditation transfers with the sale. And then they change the mission, expand to only online learning, and the accreditation is never reviewed. That has to change. I mean, it just is unconscionable for individuals to buy somebody else's accreditation and apply it to a very different kind of institution. So these are the sorts of issues that we need to step up to, and I think you're going to see a lot of movement in that arena in the U.S. In the course of this next year. So our goal will be to achieve high standards without engaging in standardization. And, you know, we're trying to get smart about Bologna and about tuning because it's headed our way. And if we don't step up to it with a more thoughtful, more creative strategy that will avoid standardization while achieving high standards, I think we're going to be severely impacted by our government, by our Congress, and by the Department of Education to engage in Bologna tuning-like strategies, which we think would diminish the quality of American higher education. So let me conclude by acknowledging this is a period of crisis and a period of opportunity. We all face challenges that have many similarities. I could have listed a lot more ground-shifting changes that I see occurring in American higher education that I'm sure you see in the UK. But I believe we can learn from one another, we can share with one another, and what a better relationship than the long-standing partnership between higher education in the UK and in America. For 300 years together, we have served as the finest systems of higher education in the world. I believe we have a wonderful opportunity to work together and continue to have fine higher education systems. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to respond to your questions now or during the break, and I am at your service, Steve.